Hi, Misha here, and as promised last time in the MiG-29 video, we're going to get to the Sukhoi SU-27, the flanker. And I have 4 different models, variants here, all 172 scale die-cast, all from Hobby Master. A few other companies make the SU-27 and 172 scale. JC Wings comes to mind. I believe Whitty used to make some. But Hobby Master, they just have a certain heft, a certain durability to them that I really like. They feel good. And to me, they're worth it. And they're very substantial in this scale. They're about a foot by a foot wide. And they have the usual Hobby Master features. Anywho, on the left, we have an early SU-27, circa 1987. And then we have a mid-production example here, actually serial number 100, as flown and eventually upgraded by the Ukrainian Air Force. And then we have the navalized variant, first known as SU-27K, later renamed SU-33. The first two are known as Flanker B. Well, this is known as Flanker D. And then finally, we have a modern 21st century SU-27SM, which is my most recent model. And speaking of that, parts of this video I recorded a little while ago before I had a couple of these. So if it seems a slight bit disjointed, I do apologize, but I don't want to re-record when I don't have to. But I did want to show you this SM because Hobby Master just released it, and because of its current use in Syria and elsewhere by Russia today. So with that, yeah, let's just dive in to this strategic, long-range, heavy fighter. And here we have the early SU-27 on the spinny thingy. Hey, I may not be able to get the models or whatever I'm doing on camera all that well all the time, but where else can you see a person put planes, guns, what have you, on a cake decorating apparatus? So nothing else, it's unique for there. And yes, this is a very large aircraft. So yeah, 1971, Sukhoi was assigned to the project. They kind of brainstormed, and in 1974, they got the go-ahead to build a prototype. And it was finished in 1977, known as the T-10, and it first flew with actually the son of Ilyushin, the maker of the IL-2, in May of that year. But the success was short-lived. In 1978, the second prototype would actually crash, and the program met with a lot of problems. Up to this point, MiG was kind of the preeminent fighter manufacturer, but Sukhoi had success, the SU-24 and SU-25, but those were attack strike aircraft. And this was a demanding thing. It needed to have superb range, endurance, durability. It needed to be able to carry a large assortment of guided missiles. Yeah, it had a lot of requirements to it. So this was something that, frankly, Sukhoi was pushing itself to design. They would internally construct 4 prototypes, with another 5 being built by state factories, so a total of 9, and testing would continue. but not all that successful. And in fact, they decided it was really due for a redesign. The first results, once they were able to get these flying, the T-10s just weren't performing up to snuff. Originally, the idea was this was to be a long-range defense aircraft for the PVO. Also, it could be a bomber escort and even interdictor or penetrator fighter, kind of like the F-111 for the BVS. And it needed to be able to combat fourth-generation aircraft like the F-15 and F-14 and F-16. And in the early 80s, after kind of analyzing the performance of the prototypes, they discovered it's not there. It's not doing it. So this required a redesign, which became known as the T-10S. The T-10S first flew, at least the prototype of the updated version, with some of the changes in 1981, April. And from there, they would continue testing and development through 1982. At that point, they had the design more or less worked out. But then they ran into manufacturing issues. So this would delay even further. It was not until 1985 that the SU-27, known as Flanker to the west, Flanker A would be the kind of the pre-production and early versions. Flanker B would be the true production versions. Anyway, it wasn't until 85 that they started to get these in service, officially accepted it, and they were small deliveries in 1986. And deliveries would remain quite small through 1987, 88. Like I said, this one's an early example from the Barents Sea. Really one of the first times that the SU-27 was flown was mock intercepts of Allied NATO fighters there. At first kind of tentative, but it wasn't until the Paris Air Show in 1989 that Russia really showed off their new aircraft to the world. And just for comparison, I kept the MiG out here. You can see just physically how much smaller it is, but you can also see that this kind of blended wing, two tails, two engines, the MiG really does resemble just a smaller version of the Sukhoi here. This aircraft is 72 feet long, has a 48-foot wingspan. It has two Saturn AL-31F engines. Actually, it's pretty interesting. The speed, it's right in there with the MiG-29. It's about the same at high altitude and nearly as good at low. So it can exceed Mach 2.3 at altitude and get to about Mach 1.1 at sea level. It's also very maneuverable considering its size. Agility was important. But whereas the MiG was very short range, especially the early versions, the Sukhoi from the outset was designed for long range endurance. So the large body here, it's a lot of fuel tanks, especially like in the wings. You don't see these carrying fuel tanks because they can carry so much internally. Also, unlike the MiG-29, this has a very good visibility for the pilot, the cockpit. The nose kind of has a droop down to it. This was also Russia's first production fly-by-wire aircraft. And we had this Stinger in the back, which at the very beginning didn't really do a whole lot except act as a counterbalance. But later on, they would start putting more countermeasures and whatnot back here. Of course, we always had a parachute for landing. So what about the armament? Well, like the MiG, it has a 30mm cannon, and like the MiG, it holds 150 shells. It's over on the right here, wing root. But its main offense were its missiles. It could carry a total of 10 6 medium range and 4 short range. Typically the short range were the R-73 and the medium range were the R-27s. And you can see this just all armed up here. There's 2 in the tunnel below it. There's 2 hanging off the engines. There is 2 more on the wings, plus the short range bombs. So it was an impressive aircraft, and pilots, generally speaking, did like it. It finally went into full service, and they started to have these in actual numbers in the summer of 1990. So the VVS and the PVO were just starting to get used to the new Sukhoi, and it was just starting to get some recognition. And they even had a 2-seat trainer, the SU-27UB, which first flew in 1987. Things were just starting to pick up, and then of course turmoil and eventually the disillusionment of the Soviet Union in 1991, which of course was very impactful for both MiG and Sukhoi. But that would not be the end, although they would struggle throughout the 1990s. But the family would really expand and is still relevant today. The SU-33, NATO reporting name Flanker D, and originally known as the SU-27K. In the 70s, the Russian Navy's premier fighter was the Yak-38. It was a V-STOL aircraft, but it had very limited range and payload, and Russia was planning to have 4 reasonably large carriers. But in 1981, the Navy was downsized, and eventually only one carrier, which we know today as the Admiral Kuznetsov, was launched. Well, in 1989, I should say. Sorry. It is late. But the Kuznetsov was the only carrier to actually go into service with Russia, although, yeah, China, Ukraine, whole story there for another video. They needed aircraft for it, and of course the main competitor would be MiG, with a version of the 29 known as the 29K, and Sukhoi here. Work would begin. Russia considered doing catapults, but quickly dropped that. Then they considered doing a ramp system, and this was modified into the ski jump system, similar to what Britain uses. And they kind of settled on that in 1982, and therefore, in 1984, Sukhoi was ordered to make a lightened version. They'd already been working with the SU-27K, at least some aspects of it. And so the design phase began in 84. By 86, they were pretty much done with that, and the prototype was known as the T-10K. And the first one would take to the skies in August of 1987, but it was far from full-featured. While it did have some of the naval aspects, it did not have the folding wings yet. It didn't have the reinforced double landing gear, landing wheels. So that's why they were able to get it into the sky. But they would take that and add features. For example, it had aerial refueling, because they figured, well, take it off the deck with limited fuel, let it top off, get to the skies, and then go from there. Of course, it had arrestor gear. It had not only folding wings, but also folding stabilizers. And interestingly, it would end up having 12 hard points instead of the original 10, meaning it could carry up to 8 R-27 missiles, as well as the 4 R-73s. And it had limited ground attack capability. It could carry 500 kilogram bombs. It could carry rockets. That was about it, originally. So they started to get full production aircraft in 1990, 1991. By this time, the Kuznetsov was taking to the seas and was working up, and some of the new SU-27Ks were being delivered and operating on board. Of course, disillusionment of the Soviet Union meant that Sukhoi needed to be more internationally marketable, so they renamed it to the SU-33, and deliveries would continue to the Russian Navy, and it finally passed trials in 1994, and 13 embarked on the carrier at the end of 1995 and would go for a Mediterranean cruise in 1996. But they were still testing and working with the systems. The SU-33 was not officially and formally adopted for Navy service until August of 1998, which was around the same time the very final aircraft were delivered. Now, originally 72 had been ordered, but that's when they thought they were going to have multiple carriers. In the end, the Navy only ended up with 26. 24 were full production models. 2 of them were pre-production or prototypes that were updated to full production status. And Sukhoi would have a few other partial, like the original T-10Ks, and a couple of demonstrators and things, meaning that most places put the estimate between 30 and 35, depending on where you draw the line at what's a true SU-33. But production was over before the end of the 20th century. And this really was Sukhoi's last effort at a true carrier-based aircraft. They tried selling these to a few places like China, India. There aren't that many navies operating carriers, and there aren't very many that can operate an aircraft this large anyway. The SU-33 is the same size as the SU-27, 72 by 48 feet, and it's actually a bit heavier and carries a little bit more payload. It does have the same 30mm cannon with 150 rounds. It's slightly slower at about Mach 2.2 at altitude and just over Mach 1 at sea level. It has a slightly lower ceiling at about 55 to 56,000 feet. By the way, I don't think I said, but the regular SU-27 has a ceiling of about 62,000 feet, so a little higher than the MiG-29. Yeah, they went into service. Really not a lot happened. They were there. Production was over really before it even got going. In fact, in 2009, the Russian Navy said that they were just going to essentially let the SU-33s run out their service lives and then replace them with an updated version of the MiG-29K. So that's what they were planning to go for. But it seems like they changed their mind, because in 2015, an upgrade program was started for these. Not only were things refurbished like the engines, in 2016 the navigation systems were updated, the weapons compatibility systems had been updated, and some of the countermeasure systems. They were given the ability to carry anti-shipping missiles and a little bit more in the air-to-surface range, but nothing like the SU-27SM. Basically, they just polished them up a bit to keep them in service because Syria happened. And it's there in 2016 that the SU-33 and Admiral Kuznetsov would finally see active, hot combat. These were launched as actually strike fighters. They were dropping 500-pound bombs on terrorist installations and also destroying warehouses containing ammunition. They were also said to be sent after training camps. So, that's a long time to wait for service if you think about it. A decade. Well, actually, 2 decades. And these airframes at that point were 25 years old. But they served. And did so well enough. At that time, there were around 19 still fully serviceable. Enough for the needs of the small carrier and what have you. Of course, as you note from the model, this has canards up here, kind of the most distinguishing feature of the SU-33. It also has a larger area for the wing. Of course, that's just for carrier landings and takeoffs and what have you. The canard really helps balance the front. I don't know, it's an interesting aircraft for sure. I do kind of wish that Hobbymaster had folding wings and stabilizers, but then at the same time I'm kind of glad they don't, because whenever you start integrating the folding stuff into models, if you look at, say, like the Air Force One, there always ends up being gaps and screws, and I guess sometimes it's better just not to do it. But of course it has the regular Hobbymaster features as gear up or down, pilot figure in or out. There was a 2-seat trainer version known as the SU-33UB as well. Unfortunately, this is a dead end, although China made an unlicensed copy as the J-15 that I've talked about in previous videos. But it was really designed for a carrier fleet that never came to fruition. But still cool, and still wanted to service, and has been used in combat. But I mostly just have it because I think the story is neat. And this model is dusty. But the next aircraft, our final one, well, it's been a lot more successful. So let's talk for a minute about the SU-27 in foreign service. Well, it did not get around as much as the MiGs. Part of it was just coming into service when the USSR broke apart. Another thing, it was more expensive, both to purchase and to operate. And because of its size, it required larger, more ornate facilities. And of course, it was only starting to get to satellite nations and parts of the USSR when the breakup occurred. And one such nation was Ukraine. When the USSR broke apart in 1991, Ukraine found itself with around 70, give or take, of these. And this is an interesting example. The one we looked at early in the video is a early production from '87. This one would have been built around 1989. And so it has a little bit different feature set, including a different stinger style, different verticals, but of course it had the same basic features. So Ukraine had theirs, and they purchased parts and assistance from Sukhoi throughout the 1990s. But in the 21st century, relations between Russia and Ukraine slowly but surely deteriorated. And after about 2009, Ukraine found it rather difficult to get more spare parts and assistance from Sukhoi. This meant that their already small fleet really started to deteriorate. And in 2012, a domestic aircraft company in Ukraine proposed a refurbishment and kind of midlife upgrade program. The government wasn't sure, but 2014 changed their mind. Of course, you had the events of the Crimea conflict, and something might have had to do with the fact they only had around 19 serviceable SU-27s left. So if they didn't do something, they were going to have none. So in August of that year, they agreed to the upgrade program, known as the SU-27S1M, if it was a 27S, or 27P1M, if it was the interceptor variant. It was basically just a airframe refurbishment, fixing any problems with things like the wings. And they did do some minor upgrades to the radar, navigation system, communication systems, computers, software, that kind of thing. But they more or less left the fire control systems, the missiles, most of the cockpit. There's a little bit of updating to the cockpit too. That was mostly just left the same. Basically just to keep them flying. Not really to make them better so much as keep them a little up to date and just make them flyable. Well, the first two refurbished and reworked SU-27S1Ms were delivered back to the Ukrainian Air Force in October of 2015. And there are plans ongoing to continue the process for at least a couple of dozen. So this is a neat model from Hobby Master, as it is kind of a Ukrainian one here. I'm told it's in a very attractive camo scheme, but it has the standard missile loadout with the R-27s and the R-73s. Standard stand, standard features. I don't know. I picked this up during COVID over a year ago, and I've been meaning to show it to you, but frankly it got put on the top shelf, and last year was so darn busy that I figured one day I'd eventually get to it. Anywho, that was, like I said, a pretty minor upgrade. But Russia, well, they had other plans, and they were much, much bigger. As we glimpsed, Sukhoi, the company, was very eager for foreign sales in the 1990s. We kind of saw that with the SU-33, and we'll definitely talk about it more in the following videos. But they had ideas to update the SU-27S and Ps for that matter, with kind of a midlife upgrade, modern things. Various things were tried and rejected, but finally, after the turn of the century, turn of the millennium really, as Russia's financial status improved and as more funding was given to the military and just, more success, they really became serious. And in 2002, they set about building a prototype. And in December of that year, the first SU-27SM took to the skies. And then the following August, in 2003, it was shown off for the first time at the Moscow Air Show, the MAX Air Show. And here we have a recent model from Hobby Master of just that. Now, a lot of the updates are internal, as you would expect. It has a glass cockpit, it has full digital controls, it has an improved radar, it has both longer range and faster processing capabilities, and most importantly, it has an air-to-ground, air-to-surface mode, making the SU-27SM a multi-role aircraft, whereas before it was an air-to-air aircraft with a very minor secondary role for dropping dumb bombs and unguided rockets. Well, now it can use the modern munitions, laser-guided, TV-guided, what have you. In fact, eventually they would update it to pretty much use the entire range of Russian munitions in the 21st century. They also updated its electronic defenses. They gave it the ability to carry jammer pods or a targeting pod. And they updated it to fire the new R-77 missile, which you can see on this one here, as well as, like I said, latest guided or smart bombs, which you can see under the fuselage here. So the ordnance package is majorly expanded. And they also had to strengthen the airframe a bit to handle the munitions. They gave it a modern navigation system with GPS access. Kind of what you'd expect, frankly. And in 2004, the VVS, later VKS, decided it wanted some, and so the first order was placed, and the first 24 SU-27SM updates were delivered in 2006, very late in that year. And quite happy with what they received for the money. Another order for 24 was placed and delivered in 2009, bringing the total up to 48. Now, Sukhoi was still courting foreign buyers. They've had quite some success in India. Their success in China is interesting. Anyway, in 2011, the Russian Air Force ended up with 12 more SU-27SMs. This was because of a canceled, never completed Chinese contract. And these are important because they had further avionics updates, further updates to weapons compatibility, wider range. The airframe was further reinforced, and at least some of them had an updated AL-31FM Saturn engine. Well, 2 of them to be exact. So a more powerful, more modern engine. I should also mention these had updated chaff and flare dispensers, that kind of thing. And this became known as the SU-27SM3, at least the 12 from 2011, and it ultimately set a new standard. Future upgraded aircraft would be upgraded to the SM3 standard, and some of the older ones might receive some, if not all, of the updates. So this is what Russia had, over 60 updated SU-27s. And they would really first see true combat when a squadron was sent to Syria in November of 2015. And because these were multi-role aircraft, they were used for air-to-air intercepts, for example, of Israeli aircraft. But also they were used for bombing missions and escort missions. They were a very economical way to recycle and reuse airframes that really hadn't seen all that much use, frankly. And it still has a very good range. We still have 10 hard points. Later variants would even have 12, kind of like we saw with the 33. And these are still known as the Flanker B, because it's still the same plane, except for the 12 from 2011, which were all new airframes. The rest were updated from older variants, again, be it the S or the P from the Soviet days. But yeah, I just had to pick this one up. It was a neat release, and I like the new ordnance, and they did a really neat job. It comes with a few extras. You get a couple more R-77 missiles if you wish to use them. And if you don't want to put the bombs under the fuselage here, you can put air-to-air. And of course you can fit them in the tunnel, but on the stand it gets a little cramped. Oftentimes when I put it back on the stand I knock them off, so I just don't. Notice it still has the older R-73 on the wings. So it's an interesting kind of combination of old and new. And it was certainly an interim step for what Sukhoi was kind of planning for next. But that really is for the next video. But I definitely wanted to show you this one. I like it. Hope it has a cool paint scheme. With that, let's line them all back up and wrap things up here. How about that? And there we have it. At least the first generation of the SU-27. 2 kind of original generation 1s and 2 upgraded generation 1s. But as you know, that's far from the end of the story. So next time we'll pick up with some of the derivatives, some of the aircraft inspired by this design. And like I said, this is still very much flying and will continue to fly. It is a very solid 4th generation jet, but Russia has moved on to 4 plus or 4.5 and even 5th generation, so yeah, that'll be next time. But I figured a big plane like this deserves a big, long video. I know you like them big and long. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.